Hello, and welcome to The Complete History of Science, Series 6, Episode 1, The World of Andreas Vesalius. The early 16th century was a time of great change. Columbus's discovery of the Americas began the age of exploration, and in 1519, the Portuguese explorer Magellan captained a fleet which circumnavigated the globe. Soon, European powers, led by Spain, would begin their brutal colonization of the American continent, reshaping both the Old and New World. Around the same time, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the All Saints' Church in Wittenberg, marking the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. This would mark the first great split in the Church in Europe, challenging the religious dominance of the Pope in Rome. As these major events unfolded, the changing political landscape of Europe accompanied a shift in the intellectual world. Education became more accessible as new schools and universities opened. By the year 1500, there were universities in most major European cities. These were bolstered by the printing press, which made technical and scientific texts from the ancient world widely available for the first time. Universities had been fundamentally conservative institutions, treating ancient works as infallible. But this began to change. In this new century, bold figures emerged who would challenge the old orthodoxies, and perhaps none were bolder than Andreas van Vesel. Born in 1514, Van Vesel, known as Vesalius, was an anatomist and physician. His family had a long connection with medicine, probably dating to his great-great-grandfather, Peter, who was reputedly the royal physician to the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick III. No definitive record of Peter's service exists, but it's known that his son, Johannes, Vesalius's great-grandfather, was the town doctor in Leuven in the early 15th century. Leuven was a prospering town at this time, and in 1425, a papal decree established the University of Leuven. Johannes led the new medical school, setting up a medical curriculum which was quite progressive for the period. While his contemporaries often practiced astrology as a means of prognosis, Johannes rejected these approaches in favour of something earthlier. He became renowned for his learning and the physician to the Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich, the position his father had supposedly occupied. Johannes's work was continued by his son Everard, who was educated in Leuven and continued the family tradition by becoming personal physician to the new Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian. The extended service of the Van Vesel family to the imperial throne led to them being granted a heraldic coat of arms, which depicted 3 weasels, a reference to the origins of the family name. Everard, however, almost put an end to this line of physicians, as his son Andreas was born out of wedlock. The boy was not outcast and lived at the family home, but his parentage meant that he would not be allowed to enter university. Fortunately, the boy was resilient and became an apothecary, what we would know as a pharmacist, eventually entering the service of another Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Charles, in gratitude, eventually recognized Andreas, which meant that his own son Vesalius would also be regarded as legitimate. Vesalius's background then was auspicious, but it was only through this good fortune that he was free to enter university. In 1530, he enrolled at the University of Louvain, working towards an arts degree, which was still the traditional first step in a university education. The curriculum had not changed greatly over the centuries, and was largely centered on the study of natural philosophy, particularly Aristotle. Despite this conservatism, Louvain was still an intellectually stimulating environment for the young Vesalius. The university was one of the primary institutions visited by the great humanist scholar Erasmus, whose new translations challenged traditional interpretations of ancient texts. At the university, Vesalius befriended an older student in the medical faculty called Gemma Frisus. Frisus was the man responsible for the letter to Copernicus's bishop, which encouraged the publication of On the Heavenly Spheres. He would also become one of the leading cartographers of the time, whose work brought a new rigour to the art of map-making. Vesalius, then, may have happily stayed in this rich environment, if not for the influence of a man called Nicolaus Florenus. Nicholas was a family friend, but also the personal physician to the Holy Roman Emperor, and had known Vesalius from a young age. With his family history, it seems destined that Vesalius would study medicine, but his father was not a physician, and so it was Florenus who would become his primary mentor. Upon his graduation, he was encouraged by Florenus to leave Leuven and go to study in Paris, which was one of the leading medical schools at the time. Vesalius listened, and in 1533 arrived in Paris and enrolled in the medical faculty. The medical curriculum at Paris was on the whole quite conservative, and hadn't changed greatly over the centuries, being largely based on Arabic medical texts. For example, Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine had been translated by Gerard of Cremona in the 13th century, and was used widely to teach medicine. Texts such as this were used because of their availability, but also because their limited scope was suitable for a university course. But signs of change emerged in the 16th century as scholars began to rediscover original Greek medical works. This was largely a consequence of the printing press, which made these texts available. Between 1490 and 1598, at least 660 different editions of Galen's work were published, along with commentaries and summaries. A preference for Galen and other Greek sources developed amongst some lecturers, who had come to believe that the Arabic translations had been corrupted. The impact of these newly available texts was enormous, and reinvigorated medical practice, where competing ideas were debated, sometimes viciously. In Paris, there were several lecturers at the vanguard of this new push towards the Greek texts. The first one Vesalius met was Jean Guinter, a classical scholar who had found a niche as an expert in Galen. Guinter was a prodigious translator who was responsible for many of the new editions of Galen which were appearing in the 16th century. He was deeply influenced by Galen's thought, and in particular the idea that knowledge of anatomy was derived from the body. In one of his translations, he wrote, "It is not enough to study the bones casually or read of them only in a book. Rather, make it your serious endeavour to examine each bone assiduously with your own eyes." The irony here is that Galen himself only had limited practical knowledge of the human body. During his lifetime, around the 2nd century AD, there was a strong taboo around touching corpses, and so he was never able to examine the body or perform dissections. His main contributions to anatomy instead came via dissections of various animals such as pigs or Barbary apes, and through analogy he made inferences about human anatomy. Galen did have access to the work of some earlier Greek anatomists, such as Herophilus and Erasistratus, who were allowed to perform dissections. Comparing himself to them, he felt keenly his own inability to examine the body. Galen was the source of the idea that knowledge of anatomy was key to the practice of medicine, and that anatomy could only be discovered through examination of the body. Vesalius, entering university just as Galen was being rediscovered, became deeply influenced by his ideas. Like Galen, Vesalius came to believe that to practice medicine, it was necessary to know the human body, and to know the body, it was necessary to perform dissections. Vesalius would follow Galen's insight, but unlike the old doctor, he was fortunate because he was allowed to perform dissections. The prohibition against dissection had been in effect throughout the early Christian period, as well as in the Islamic East, where, in both cases, religious prohibitions prevented dissections. This changed in the late Middle Ages, when dissections of the human body once again began to be performed. The first dissections took place in Bologna in the early 14th century, and the most important figure in this revival was a man known as Mondino de Lusi, sometimes Latinized as Mondinus. A professor of medicine, Mondino's goal was to provide for his students an introduction to human anatomy. Teaching in a university, he realized, as many of his successors would, that there was no single textbook suitable for a university course. In response, he created his own, which provided a guide to students through the process of dissection. Dissections would always follow the same procedure, starting with the abdominal cavity before moving on to the thorax and finally the head. 200 years later, dissections were still performed in much the same way, and when Vesalius attended some at the University of Paris, he soon realized their limitations. In the first instance, these dissections were very rare. In Paris, bodies of convicted criminals were usually used, but the supply was irregular. It's reckoned that at the time, around 3 dissections a year took place. These dissections also had to occur very quickly, over the course of 2 to 3 days, as there were no adequate ways to preserve the body. But what annoyed Vesalius the most was the way the dissections were performed. In front of a crowd of students, the lecturer, known as the Doctor Extraordinary, sat in a high chair above the demonstration, reading from a textbook. The actual business of cutting was done by a Doctor Ordinary, sometimes known as a barber surgeon, who would expose and remove body parts as the text was read aloud. Later in life, Vesalius railed against this method, calling it a vile ritual. To Vesalius, the professors were ignorant in that they only knew the body through books rather than direct experience. This was, of course, by design. The reintroduction of dissection was a tool for pedagogy rather than research. For Mondino and his later followers, Galen and the ancient Greek doctors possessed infallible knowledge, which they intended only to transmit rather than challenge. Dissections were never intended as a method of acquiring new knowledge, but as a way to give students some practical experience of the human body before they would go out and practice medicine. This attitude persisted at the beginning of the 16th century, but nevertheless, change was in the air. After a few years in Paris, Vesalius would be handed an opportunity which would allow him to gain hands-on experience. His lecturer, Guinter, was working on a new handbook for medical students based on Galen's anatomy. In the course of composing this new work, Guinter wished to confirm Galen's observations, and so asked some of his students to assist. Vesalius was the most enthusiastic of these new dissectors, and together with Guinter would set out on a series of human dissections. The result of this work was published in 1536 as a handbook called the Institutions, and under Gwynter's influence, the final product was heavily Galenic. Gwynter gave Vesalius credit in the introduction, calling him a very skilled dissector of bodies. Vesalius, though, would not be so generous in return. Later in life, he would be highly critical of Gwynter for not performing the dissections himself. While he revered Gwynter for his knowledge of Galen, calling him my honoured teacher, he disparaged him as an anatomist, saying, "But I wish there may be inflicted on my body as many strokes as I have ever seen him attempt to make incisions in the bodies of other men." Gwynter may have claimed to be a Galenist and endorsed Galen's ideas that anatomy should come from experience, but he failed to practice what he preached. 2 years later, Vesalius would return to this work alone, editing and correcting the original as he saw fit. This new edition was unauthorized, and although Gwynter is credited as the author, Vesalius added a generous new dedication to himself. This may have been fair, as it's generally accepted that Vesalius played a much greater role in the publication of the book than Gwynter had originally acknowledged. While in Paris, Vesalius came across another lecturer called Jacob Silvius. Like Gwynter, Silvius was a humanist and translator with an extensive knowledge of Galen. Unlike Gwynter, who was known as a kind and affable man, Silvius had a reputation as crude and obnoxious. He was known for his cheapness and would refuse lectures until students' fees were paid in full. In contrast to Gwynter, who was assisted by students or barber surgeons, Silvius performed dissections himself. Silvius was not employed at the University of Paris, but instead at the smaller college of Tréguier. There, Silvius dissected animals, primarily dogs, and Vesalius mentions that these were the first praiseworthy dissections he witnessed in Paris. The lectures were in fact very popular, and despite the awful smell of decomposing animals, drew large audiences of students, lecturers, and commoners. While at the university, lectures were superficial, Silvius's dissections illuminated Galen's anatomy, combining his knowledge of the literature with direct anatomical demonstrations. Vesalius was inspired by this work and would say that he would not have set his own hand to anatomy if it were not for these lectures. Just as he was finding his feet in Paris, life changed due to forces beyond his control. In 1536, during his third year in Paris, war threatened to break out between France and the Holy Roman Empire. Vesalius, as a subject of the Emperor Charles V, found himself in an awkward position, especially as his father was still in the service of the emperor. In the spring, the French king pushed his troops towards northern Italy, while in response, Charles attacked the Flemish borderlands. Vesalius feared he would be identified as an enemy alien amongst Paris's student population, and given his connections, there was little chance he could have claimed neutrality. By the summer, Vesalius fled for his life, back to Louvain. Vesalius was yet to graduate and may have been despondent at his ill fortune. But in Louvain, he would have soon realized that his work in Paris had won him quite the reputation back home. Paris's medical school was held in high regard, and lecturers such as Gwynter were widely esteemed. Vesalius's contribution to Gwynter's handbook was a great boon for the young man, and amongst the students and lecturers at Louvain, Vesalius was looked upon with a mixture of awe and envy. Not long after arriving back, he was asked to begin performing dissections as an informal instructor. These were performed privately in the university, and Vesalius took the opportunity to improve his dissection skills. His reputation was such that he was also called upon to perform an autopsy of a young lady who died prematurely under suspicion of poisoning. This was a rare occasion and the first autopsy in the town for several decades. But more so for Vesalius, it was also an opportunity to examine the female anatomy. Vesalius soon completed his thesis and at 22 had garnered a reputation which spread throughout Europe. Upon the award of his medical degree, he was offered a chair in surgery and anatomy at the University of Padua. Italy was perhaps the one place which exceeded Paris's reputation, and in Padua he would have the freedom to complete his own research. Vesalius, young and bold, grasped this opportunity, and seemingly without apprehension, set out for Italy.